Today's guest is Mitch Russo. He's built numerous eight-figure companies. He's a best-selling author, and he's the host of the business podcast, Your First 1,000 Clients. So Mitch, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, Tats, great to see you. My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
You've done a lot of entrepreneurial stuff. How did that all start?
Yeah, well, I mean, you told me before we only had 35 minutes. It would take me that long just to tell you how this all
Give
started.
Give me the highlights.
Okay, so the highlights were that I was a scrawny kid in high school and couldn't pick up girls, so I started a band.
Oh.
And it turned out that was the greatest thing I could ever do. I started getting dates and girlfriends and all that stuff, and later applied a lot of what came very natural to me and decided to build a business out of the band. So as a kid, we did things that, most kids would probably not think of, or maybe for me anyway, it was kind of intuitive. I would hang posters in the supermarket, or I would walk around with a clipboard, and anytime we played a gig, I would get a written testimonial. Later, I found out that I could send announcements to the local newspaper and have them print them, which was shocking to me as a kid that, you could have that kind of, wow, it's like I have a direct line into the newspapers. Wow. And so I learned a lot of stuff, frankly, that were the primary and core lessons I needed as an entrepreneur. I learned about publicity. I learned about promotion. I learned about price testing. We started playing for $50 a night.
Yeah.
The whole band, we'd find our way to rent a car and have a driver, and because we were too young to drive.
Sure.
And then later, by 9 months later, we were charging $500 a night.
Wow.
And remember now, this goes back into the 1970s, so that was a lot of money back then. So you cover stuff, and then later in life, I didn't think college was for me. I wasn't sure. I tried a few times, different schools, but my true passion was not really business; it was electronics. I won most science fairs as a kid. I was an introvert, so science appealed to me, and for some reason, I decided to go to school to learn how to fix color television sets. And I remember taking this one class, digital electronics course, and this again is in the 1970s. And we were all confused as kids. We went, well, why would we be taking a digital electronics course? Everyone knows that there's nothing inside of a TV but tubes. But the professor was adamant about it. And by the time we graduated, that professor had personally tutored me basically almost exclusively because he saw some aptitude, and then later told me the week I was supposed to graduate, he said, "You'll never fix a color television set in your entire life." And he was right. I got an offer to enter the computer business, which I did.
Yeah.
And joined a computer company, and then made my way up through there. And eventually I became a field applications engineer for a semiconductor company. Got jealous of all the sales guys who were making all that money. So I went into sales. And then from sales, it was very interesting. From sales, I started to make really very, very, very big money for a young guy. 28 years old, I was my commission checks were $34,000 a month.
Wow.
So that back then even was a lot of money. It's a lot of money today.
Yeah.
But here's the interesting thing. When the recession back then hit, my peers said, well, we've been through this before. You just tough it out. 3-4 years from now, it'll all come back. And I said, screw that. I don't have 3 and 4 years. I decided to start a company. And that's when I started Timeslips Corporation. And Timeslips Corporation was a company that I started with a neighbor in my garage or over my garage with $5,000.
Yeah.
And all those lessons starting a rock band started to come back and pay off big time. And I'll fast forward to the end of the story. Sure. 9 years later, we had over 100 employees. We were the number one product in our field, which was legal time and billing.
Yeah.
And we were bought by Sage for 8 figures. which basically set me up for life
Okay.
financially. And then from there, all of my decision points changed because at that point stopped really worrying, quote unquote, about money and started focusing entirely on what really lights my fire. What do I really want to do with my life? And like many people who go through this process, and many have,
Yeah.
uh, we all sort of come to the same place, which is how can we help others? How can we help other entrepreneurs get to where
Hmm.
we've been? And more
Sure.
importantly, what are the high quality lessons that we learned that will be of value to other people? And
Yeah.
and that to me is what my journey is about today.
Once you sold your company, you work with Tony right after, or how'd that all happen? Tony and Chet,
Well,
by the way.
sure. So what ended up happening is that while I was building my software company, people would come at us all the time trying to sell us stuff.
Sure.
And there was this one guy who was incredibly persistent. His name was Chet Holmes. And Chet was trying to sell me advertising space in a legal publication. And logically so, it should have been. I was a good prospect. In fact, it turns out, if you know Chet's work, I was one of his Dream 100 clients, if you will.
Yes. Yes.
And so the bottom line was that he was targeted me. I thought he was kind of a caricature, a joke in a sense, because he was just that persistent. It was like, really, can this guy be for real? Um, and he worked on me for over a year, and he would fly out here from California to
Yeah.
visit Boston and take me to dinner, and then it turned out that I ended up negotiating a ridiculous deal. I never thought he would take it, but he did. I negotiated a double page, full
Yeah.
color spread in the
Yeah.
magazine for the
Yeah.
price of a single black and white ad.
Wow.
And he said yes, and I at that point said, "Look, I don't think I can get any better than that." I said yes, and it turned out to have an enormous impact on the company.
Wow.
And so we increased our ad budget in his magazine, which grew and grew, and we ended up becoming best of friends. So in
Yeah.
about 1989 or so, friendship began. And later in life, I mean, even after I sold the company, we stayed friends,
Yeah.
best of friends, and we got involved in each other's families and family
Yeah.
events and all these great things. And eventually he said to me one day, he goes, "Look, I'm having a problem." He asked me for some help. I stepped in to assist him. And next thing you know, I'm working with him at his company as in effect as an independent contractor.
Yeah.
Later, he asked if I would come aboard and run the company as the president, and I said I would. Shortly after that, he and I began negotiating with Tony Robbins. The three of us would get on a phone call every Thursday night. I was on the East Coast. Tony and Chet were on the West Coast, so my call didn't start till 11, sometimes midnight, and we would go for 2 3 hours trying to figure out the business model, trying to come up with ways to make this a triple win for all of us.
Yeah.
Until finally we said, you know what, let's do it, and we built the company and we launched it. It turned out we launched it after deciding to do it. 6 weeks later, we found a way to bring 500 people into a ballroom in Las Vegas, and that's how we launched the Ultimate Business Mastery Summit.
Wow. That's
And that was the
awesome.
beginning. That was the beginning. That's how the whole thing started.
Wow. That's amazing. I know I ran across Chet's work. Microsoft used to have this kind of digital library of speakers like way back.
Hmm.
And I ran across Chet's presentation. I think this is before he had his book, and he was pretty compelling. And I think he's been underappreciated. And he had the I think he passed away too soon.
Me too.
But I think a lot of what he's done is he's underrated quite a bit for
Yep.
for what he's done. So
Yep. Agreed. Agreed. He had pioneered some stuff, and Chet was he had a natural, like almost a knack for for using language in a persuasive way. And he would name things and have names for things that really set them apart.
Mm,
In some of the cases, from what other people were doing entirely, even though in some ways they were very similar.
yeah.
But he would use these monikers and describe them in a way that just made everything super compelling. And
Really? Give me an
yeah,
example. So,
well, the stadium pitch
yeah.
concept, that was in Chet's book. The stadium pitch, for those who don't know it, are the idea would be if I were able to put all of your ideal prospects into a stadium and put you on stage, and you could say anything you wanted, but here's the catch: anyone can leave anytime they want. So
Mm,
how do you get the most people to stay who are potentially customers for your product? And he just took that example and turned it into a lesson and a way to explain how to use persuasive language, and more importantly, how to tune into what people truly want. And that's where he coined the term education-based marketing, where he said that it's much better to educate than to sell. Of course, people probably knew that for years, but no one ever really quite said it that way. And he and I and the rest of the company really were quite uh, loyal to that concept, and that everything we did was education based.
you wrote a book about, I guess, am I saying it correctly? Creating a virtual organization. How did that all come about?
Well, that's what happened was that after Chet passed away,
Yeah.
um, I felt like I needed to stop and take a breather.
Yeah.
And so I called Tony and I said to him, I'm going to be resigning. I hope you understand that I would stay on if you want me to, but I don't think at this point I'm going to be of good to anybody for the next 3 to 6 months. I just need a break. So I did that. I took that break, and then I came back and I said, okay, now what am I going to do next? And so I started to speak to some of the people in my world who I considered friends, and I think considered me friends, and asked them what they thought of me and what my capabilities were. And
Hmm.
one of those people was a guy named Jay Abraham. And so
Yes.
I called Jay and I said, Jay, what do I do? I mean, I just got done with this whole thing. It was 5 years of pouring my life into this thing and taking it from not quite zero, but almost zero to almost 30 million in revenue. And he said to me, Mitch, the one thing I could tell you, I don't know what you should do, but you can't let what you know go to waste.
Hmm.
And I said, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, you have to find a way to teach others what you just did, because it's kind of unusual and even a little bit extraordinary.
Hmm.
And I said, well, how would I do that? He goes, I don't know. I'm just telling you what my feeling is. And so I hung up on that call a little bit confused, a little bit inspired, a little bit intrigued, and a lot challenged by Jay
Yeah.
Abraham. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so I thought about it and I started to write down things I knew. I figured I might as well figure out what it is he thinks I know that I don't quite understand myself. But I did. I started writing these things down, and went through the long, winding process of writing a book. And so once I figured out what the meaning of the book was and the purpose of the book was, the name Invisible Organization showed up in my world, and I
Wow.
grabbed it. I grabbed the URL, and at that point, the book came together very fast once I realized what it was truly about. And what it really is it's a blueprint of how I built a 300 plus organization completely virtually.
Mm.
And but it wasn't so much that, like, okay, I use this piece of software to do this thing. Yeah, that's in it, but it was two elements that I think made it much different.
Hmm.
Number one was understanding the mindset of a person running a virtual organization, which is, to me, all about what success and failure is for that type of a company.
Yeah.
And then, that was a challenge, because the mindset to me came very naturally, because that was my mindset, but I
Sure.
didn't realize it wasn't other people's. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So what I decided to do is interview some folks and figure it out. And I felt like I had put together a blueprint of what that mindset should look like.
Sure.
The next thing was, yeah, we talked about the process itself, how to go virtual. And then I realized that, we actually had some superpowers that other companies didn't have because we were virtual. For example, we were able to scale a sales organization in hours, days, compared to others who would spend 6, 7, 8 weeks trying to hire just a small group of people.
Yeah.
So we talked about the hiring process. We talked about the marketing process. We talked about how do you promote a virtual organization in a digital world and all that. Now, admittedly, a lot of this stuff is now kind of common knowledge, and people do it all the time at some level. But back then, it was kind of innovative. I mean, the book today has value from the standpoint of, like I said before, the mindset of the CEO, and also understanding, what is possible once you go virtual. We saved Tony $1 million in rent just by helping him understand how to consolidate, the organization the way eventually he did. And so the book was great at the time. It gave me a focus. It gave me something to do. Uh, and it brought a couple of clients in, which was nice secondarily. But for the most part, it was also my very first book, so it established me as a writer. And I liked the feeling of having written a book and being a writer. It wasn't until 3 years later um, that I released my second book. And the reason I released my second book was because uh, I had perfected a process of building certification that
Mm,
I've never quite seen anywhere else. And um, Chet taught me many years ago that it's best to knowledge is free. Basically, you share your knowledge, and what
yeah.
you charge for is implementation. And he proved it to me over and over again. And so I said, you know what? Thank you, buddy. I'm going to take your lesson here, and I'm going to pour everything I know into my book, Power Tribes. And sure enough, um, it's worked. It's brought me clients. I work right now with companies, just finished one certification program, working on now another client certification program, and they're incredibly fun to do. I love being the band leader and orchestrating this whole process, and then watching that moment in time when we finally launched the program, and then hundreds of thousands of dollars pour in the door. I mean, I have had the reaction of owners just break down and cry and thank me for everything.
So,
You
so
know,
it, for people that don't know, what's a certification process?
well, first of all, let's identify what is certification. So,
Sure.
most people know certification as having heard of things like Infusionsoft certification
Yes.
partners,
Yes.
uh, or Intuit's certified advisor program. This is when a company goes and tests some of their best customers and then says, okay, you're smart enough, you seem to have understood everything enough, you can now help others implement our solution, whether it's a software or a system type solution.
Yeah.
Well, what I discovered is that by itself, that's not enough.
Hmm.
And it turns out that without a culture, certification turns into entropy. It completely self destructs. And that's because if you put any group of people together, the personalities of that group are going to define the direction of the group as opposed to the group founder who has to define the direction of the group. So, what I did is I created a 38-point culture code, and I created an entire map for building culture inside of a paid community like a certified partners organization. And this, by the way, is how Intuit built theirs. I taught the CEO of Intuit how to create certification back in the early days. His name was Scott Cook. I think he's on the board, but he was the founder of Intuit many years ago. And Scott and I were friends. He said, "Hey, what's all this certification stuff? Can you share that with me?" And I did freely. He was a friend, and later, he paid me back many times over by giving me access to um, the code base, which I never would have had access to, so that we could link up time slips and QuickBooks together.
You talked about the mindset of a company running a virtual organization. Like that's a hot topic right now. What is the mindset for someone that is a bit more brick and mortar?
Well, Yeah, I mean, if you think about the way many people manage people,
Yeah.
how do you manage a group? Well, in the 80s and 90s, people of that generation were taught a phrase that has an acronym MBWA, Management by Walking Around.
Mm,
And what that meant is you got up out of your chair, you lazy bones, and you walked to your facility 2 or 3 times a day. And whether it's a manufacturing facility or whether it's a telemarketing organization, you just walk through your organization and you're paying attention. You're not on your phone. You're not texting. You're not talking to somebody else who's walking you through. You walk around and you pay attention. And what people have found in prior years is that this was very effective. Because number one, it showed your staff members that you care. Number three, it gave you a real feel for what's going on in the organization. Being the CEO or the president, the vice president, you could listen in on anything you want and offer your opinion,
yeah.
hopefully to improve the situation. So those types of people are a little bit scared about maybe relinquishing all that control.
Sure.
So when I talk about mindset, what I'm trying to explain today is that um, the average CEO doesn't communicate enough to his people. So that's an important element here. You need to understand that if you really want to run a team virtually, you have to be in pretty much constant communication. Now, today we have tools we didn't have back then. We have things like Slack.
Yeah.
Now, and the reason I say Slack and not Zoom, because, well, Zoom is ubiquitous at this point, but what Slack does is it gives people a place to quote unquote hang out, an open channel, if you will. And it's a little bit, I mean, we use Microsoft Teams as well in the same way, but for the most part, a product like that, whether it be Teams or Slack, allows the CEO to be able to monitor what's going on in these rooms. The other thing is that we have call center software, virtual call center software that, again, many years ago we never had, and that kind of software gives us the chance to literally listen in or watch as people complete their calls. We have other more invasive tools, which I haven't used, but I know people do, where if you send people home, they download a bundle of software that
Mm,
monitors their keystrokes and takes snapshots of their screen as they go throughout the day. And in fact, some of them take snapshots off of their webcam so they could see them whether they're at their desk or not. And others have monitoring software that watches the webcam for movement, and if movement stops, then it calls attention to a manager who says, "Hey, we're paying Joe to be at his desk and working, and our systems detected that no one's been at that desk for the last 20 minutes or something." So there's lots and lots of systems, and that's where mindset comes in. Turns out that without a lot of those super invasive things, you don't need them really. You can actually do a much better job of managing people than you could ever by walking around. That's for sure.
What role does hiring the right mindset for a person, like a self starter, play in a remote culture?
Well, there's many different positions that potentially you would hire for. I'll talk first about salespeople because I think
Sure.
salespeople are, in some ways, the easiest to motivate and the easiest to hire if you know how. So the one thing I love about hiring and motivating salespeople is that, for the most part, they're motivated by money. They have less interest in prestige. They have less interest in title or position. They really just want to be paid as much money as they could possibly be paid,
Sure.
and that's great because you want them to make the most possible money that they can. And if you set up your commission programs properly, and this might be a little unintuitive for many sales executives, where they actually make more money the better they sell, you'll keep them for a long time and they'll do really, really well and they'll do well for the company. They also transition well into management if they understand the mentality of
Mhm.
management.
Mm,
So that again is a mindset issue. Management has to understand that it's okay for some of their salespeople to make more than the CEO.
mhm.
And the reason is because frankly, they're driving revenue. They're driving top line revenue, so they deserve that money. And if everybody's making more than the CEO, then your pay plan is completely wrong. Ideally, it should be about 4 to 10% of the sales population are making top dollar. So my perspective has always been, you know, pay pay salespeople the best you possibly can and get the highest performance people possible, and that's very much a mindset issue as well. The other thing is that we used personality tests extensively to determine whether someone has the ability to work independently
Mm.
and has the capacity to do different types of tasks. So that became a major tool in our tool chest about how to judge folks before we, in fact, many of the people we hired, we never even met once, but we knew for certain that they would be good at their job. And I would say that those tests are much more effective than people give them credit for.
Mm. Which
And
ones
I
are you
could tell,
referring to?
well, I mean, we use a family of tests from a company called selfmanagement.com.
Okay.
And what we found is that the tests are so accurate that even if your own gut feeling says, you know what, I really like this person, the test said he won't do well, but I really, really like him. I really think he'd be great. I'm going to hire him anyway. 9 out of 9 times I've done that, the test was right. So
Wow,
you
that's
gotta you gotta respect the process and the tools that you use because that's kind of what's going on.
yeah,
Those are the types of things that really pay off. So
yeah.
that's another thing. Once you start to depend on tools, it doesn't mean you stop looking to up level them, but you depend on them and you make them work for you. That's the most important thing.
You've done a lot of recruiting, sort of mass sales organizations. Any tips for our listeners there?
To recruit or to be recruited? What do you tell
To
me? What
recruit, I mean, I think people are always trying to grow their top line. How do you attract the best salespeople to come with you? What sort of campaigns? What sort of things? I mean, you talked about your certification, culture as a sales driver. What other things can someone do to grow their sales network or team?
Well, first of all, it starts with who you hire, and what it always comes down to, I don't want to make it sound so simple that it's not accurate, but there is a simplicity to this. If you look at somebody's past performance,
Hmm.
and you then apply what I would call a personality analysis,
Hmm.
um, you'll have a fairly clear picture as to where you can take that person. So what I mean, and I'll give you an example of what I mean by personality
Sure.
analysis. We had a woman who worked in our organization who was a very high performer.
Yes.
The problem is that she was getting sick every 4 to 6 weeks.
Ah.
And so what we understood and what we came to understand about her is that her high performance came at a cost.
Mm.
She was brute forcing it and kept her performance very high, but it wasn't a natural element of who she was or how she did things.
Ah.
And as a result, she got sick a lot. And her getting sick a lot was kind of the clue, if you will, that
Yeah.
tipped us off as that there was something wrong. And so, what we tried to do is we tried to see if we could place her in a position that would help her not be as sick as she was, and at the same time, optimize the environment as well, so that we could take advantage of her strengths
Sure.
without taxing her health. And it took a little bit of doing, but it took the effort to understand her better, and it paid off. She did great in the job that she eventually was in. So it's important to understand what the nature of your people are, and personality testing kind of does that. That's where it turns out we did our best work.
So what sort of stuff are you doing now? Like what's the future look like?
Well, as you know, I have a award-winning podcast syndicated with C-Suite Network. It's called Your First 1,000 Clients. I'm publishing interview number 200 in the next week or so,
Wow.
couple of weeks. And so I've really focused on finding incredible entrepreneurs who have made it. And so that's been really, really good. And I've used my podcast to position my guests as ideal clients. So if I interview somebody on my show, odds are there's someone I would target as an ideal client for me. The second thing that I do is I build, as I said, certification programs. And so I feel like I'm always enjoying that type of work because, number one, it's very involved. I work very closely with the founders of the company, and we're together for a long time getting this thing built and launched. And so for me, it's been a joy to work there. And then, I've been, as I mentioned to you before we clicked on the microphones, I've also been creating a lot of new products too. So I have some new stuff coming in down the pike pretty soon. I've always been a software developer, so I have a new piece of software coming out in a couple of months just for coaches. It's specifically for coaches and mental health professionals that will help them with their clients. And so some exciting stuff happening in my world. When I'm not involved in business and entrepreneurship, my passion is photography.
Ooh.
And so I've been a international photographer, landscape photographer, all of my life. And anyone could go to see my work at mitchrussotravels.com.
Nice.
And that for me is really, if I had the ability and the stamina to do nothing but travel, and we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, that's where you'd find me. I already take, under normal circumstances, at least 4 trips a year. The trip I took right before shutdown was to where was I? I was in Asia for 2 weeks, and Myanmar. I was in Myanmar and had an amazing trip. The pictures from Myanmar are on my website as well. So I also take a small group of photographers with me to Iceland just about every year. I love the entire experience. I love even the 16 to 19-hour flights. I know it sounds crazy, but I just love them. Some flights I could get on the plane with my laptop and leave with a new book or a new program.